Imagine just a single, straight line drawn on a map. Just a simple stroke of a pen, right? Yet that one tiny line has literally caused over 100 years of continuous war. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're unpacking one of the most fascinating and honestly devastating geopolitical phenomenons in modern history. You know, we're always taught that the British Empire officially ended the second the flags were lowered. But as we're going to see, the map never actually ended. It brings up this really terrifying reality of, well, ink that bleeds. I mean, think about it. The empire that actually drew these borders vanished decades ago. The bureaucrats sitting in their air-conditioned London offices, holding the rulers and the pens, long dead. To us today, the empire is basically just a ghost. And yet, right at this very moment, millions of people across the globe are still fighting, they're still being displaced, and yeah, they are still bleeding over that exact same ink.
So, why? Why on earth are we still dealing with this? Well, the core thesis we're exploring today is that the British Empire never truly died. Instead, it just transformed. It became this invisible geopolitical labyrinth. What they left behind was a phantom network of arbitrary borders, jagged partitions, and frankly, engineered ethnic conflicts that are basically functioning like time bombs in our modern world. But to really get this, we need to look at the actual men who drew the lines. Which brings us to Section 1, the 5-week phantom, focusing on the Radcliffe Line.
So, transport yourself back to the sweltering summer of 1947. The British are financially broken after the war, and they are absolutely desperate to exit India. To prevent a civil war, they decide to partition the region into two entirely separate nations, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. And to draw this monumental border, they bring in a guy named Sir Cyril Radcliffe. Now, Radcliffe was a brilliant London lawyer, sure. But get this, prior to this assignment, he had never been east of Paris. No way, right? He was completely ignorant of Indian culture, the geography, and the deeply, deeply complex demographics of the area. Plus, he's working in this suffocating heat, relying on totally outdated maps and super old census data. But here is the absolutely crucial point, the timeline. 5 weeks. That is the exact amount of time the British government gave this man to divide a subcontinent of 400 million people. Just let that sink in for a second. 5 weeks to untangle communities that had literally coexisted for 1,000 years. It was a completely impossible deadline, and, well, the result was exactly what you'd expect. Radcliffe basically dropped a giant ruler across the map and just sliced right through it. The line he drew cut directly through ancestral villages. We're talking about a border so wildly arbitrary that it literally sliced through individual homes, like putting a family's kitchen in one new country and their living room in another. It severed railway lines, it divided rivers, and it completely ignored the actual realities on the ground. And then, well, he packed his bags, flew back to England, and allegedly burned all his papers, because even he was horrified by what he'd just done. The fallout from this was instantaneous and just catastrophic. The second the line was revealed in August 1947, it triggered the largest mass migration in human history. The subcontinent just erupted into chaos. We're talking up to 2 million people dead and 15 million displaced. And because Radcliffe left the status of the Kashmir region totally ambiguous, India and Pakistan have since fought 4 major wars over it. Today, both nations literally have nuclear weapons aimed at each other, all across a border drawn by a guy who couldn't even handle the Indian heat. All right, let's move on to Section 2, the Mountain Divide, looking at the Durand Line. Shifting our focus now from the plains of India to the incredibly rugged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains, we find a border that honestly explains the last 30 years of global terrorism. It's called the Durand Line. Back in 1893, a British diplomat named Sir Mortimer Durand sat down with the Emir of Afghanistan and drew this 1,600-mile line. Why? Strictly to secure the borders of British India against the expanding Russian Empire. It was just a buffer zone. They completely and totally ignored the people who actually lived in those mountains. And that brings us to the Pashtun people, the largest tribal society on Earth. See, Durand didn't care about ethnicity. His 1,600-mile line slashed directly through the heart of their homeland. So, literally overnight, half the Pashtun population found themselves in Afghanistan and the other half in British India. It severed this entirely unified homeland and created a massive political vacuum. Because to the local people living there, this line simply did not exist. Which naturally leads us to ask this incredibly important modern question. When the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, armed with the most powerful military in human history, why couldn't they defeat the Taliban? Like,
how does a 19th century map dictate a 21st century war?
Well, the answer is it's the ultimate blind spot. Because Afghanistan never officially recognized the Durrant Line and the local tribes completely ignored it, militants used it to their immense advantage. Whenever they were pursued by the U.S. military, insurgent groups, and even Osama bin Laden himself, would simply cross this invisible, unpoliceable British line right into Pakistan's tribal areas. And the U.S. military? They legally couldn't follow them. So over 100 years after it was drawn, a British bureaucrat's pen stroke was literally providing a safe haven for global militants.
Okay, on to Section 3, the divide and rule strategy, or as I like to think of it, malice over incompetence.
Now, up to this point, you might be thinking, okay, the British were just super rushed, or maybe they were just really bad at geography. But actually, no. These chaotic borders weren't geographical mistakes at all. They were highly calculated imperial tactics. There's this saying, the chaos wasn't a failure of the exit strategy, the chaos was the exit strategy. When the British retreated, they deliberately handed power to local elites within these inherently unstable borders. Because think about it, if these new nations were perpetually fighting internal civil wars and border disputes, they would never ever be strong enough to challenge Western hegemony.
Really think about the brutal logic required here. How does a relatively small island nation manage to control millions of people all across the globe? Well, first, you identify a large population you want to control. Second, to prevent them from uniting against you, you actively exploit existing ethnic or religious fault lines, or, just create brand new ones entirely. Finally, you just keep those factions fighting each other, because as long as they're fighting each other, they aren't fighting the colonizer. It was a feature, not a bug.
And hey, if you doubt for a second that this was a deliberate, repeatable strategy, just look at the global scars. The application was literally identical worldwide. In Cyprus, they actively played Greeks against Turks. In Sri Lanka, they systematically favored the Tamil minority over the Sinhalese majority, which essentially baked in a brutal civil war decades down the line. In the Middle East, teaming up with the French, they drew the infamous Sykes-Picot lines. This forced sworn enemies into these artificial states like Iraq and Syria, while deliberately ensuring that groups like the Kurds were left completely stateless.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 4, the poison chalice, or living with the ghost.
We live in a world that really prides itself on high-tech modernity. When we pull up a map on our phones, we subconsciously just assume those lines represent this permanent, natural reality. But they don't. Just look at the headlines today. You've got the standoff in Kashmir, endless instability in Afghanistan, heartbreaking bloodshed in the Middle East, ethnic tensions across Africa. It's so common for us to dismiss these as just, ancient hatreds or unsolvable tribal wars. But they're not. They are the direct, entirely predictable fallout of lines drawn with ink and rulers by men who often never even laid eyes on the land they were dividing.
Which leaves us with this pretty chilling final thought. The flags might be stored away in museums now, and the former colonies might proudly call themselves free, but as long as nations continue to fight, bleed, and die over these arbitrary borders, the empire's ghost still rules the world. The map never ended. We are all just living in its margins. So the next time you look at a globe, ask yourself, whose ink are you really looking at? Thanks for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope it gave you a completely new lens on how to view our world.